Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar titled Attain PCI Compliance Without AV. Today's webinar will be recorded and available after the webinar session is over. All lines will be muted throughout today's presentation, so if you have any questions, please submit them through the questions box and our presenter will answer them at the end of this webinar. Today our presenter is Michael Mashiri, Director of Advanced Endpoint Protection at Palo Alto Networks. Michael is a seasoned cybersecurity executive with over 2 decades of leadership experience in information security and marketing. He leads the marketing of Palo Alto Networks endpoint protection product, Traps, which helps organizations prevent security breaches. Before Palo Alto Networks, Michael served as a client service leader at PwC, Deloitte, and Ernst & Young. He's an international #1 best-selling author and a frequent speaker at information security conferences and events. Michael, I'll turn it over to you to kick us off.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for being on this event with me. And looking forward to talking to you about PCI compliance. Today, we're going to discuss how to achieve and maintain compliance with the PCI Data Security Standards, or DSS, without using legacy antivirus. For the sake of our discussion, I'm assuming that you're familiar with PCI DSS and the processes for attaining compliance for your organization, as well as the basic endpoint security concepts. So I won't dive into those in much detail. But before we dive into the details of the rest of this webinar, there's one important fact that we should highlight. This is something that most organizations that are expected to comply with PCI DSS usually don't consider, at least not consciously. But it is something that's very important to remember because it does set the foundation for having a meaningful conversation with your QSA about why, how, and with what you should replace your legacy AV. And that fact is this. The truth is that legacy AV, meaning the traditional signature-based antivirus that has been the de facto standard for endpoint security for decades, no longer meets the intent of PCI DSS requirements. Now, this is a bold statement, I realize that, but I will tell you why it is true in just a moment. What's really important about this statement and why you should pay close attention to the rest of this presentation is this. Legacy AV may be meeting the letter of the standards today, but it's not meeting the intent of the standards. And this mismatch is something that you can bet the PCI Security Standards Council is also aware of and will be doing something about very soon. And that's something that we're going to discuss here today as well. Plus, the answer to a few other questions that you should be asking. I apologize for the animation on the system not working. At any rate, we're going to discuss several questions and answers. First of all, we're going to talk about why legacy AV doesn't meet the intent of PCI DSS, and why, if that's true, the PCI Council has not updated the standards already. And we're also going to discuss what you should be doing to make sure that you and your organization are covered. In other words, what type of solution would help you to meet the intent and the letter of the PCI requirements now and in the future, so you're future ready, if you will. And most importantly, we're going to discuss how Palo Alto Networks customers accomplish that today. So let's start with the why. Now, if you want to learn about the intent of the PCI DSS, you don't have to look much further than the introduction section of the standards document itself. On the very first page after the table of contents, you'll find a declaration of intent in the very first paragraph. And it says, PCI DSS provides a baseline of technical and operational requirements designed to protect account data. Now, if you think back to December of 2004 when the first version of the standards were published, and you consider what the AV solutions of that time were able to accomplish in the threat landscape of the time, you'll notice that back then, AV was able to prevent most computer viruses from infecting a system. But today's threat landscape is vastly different than that of 2004. So if you look at what it takes to protect endpoint systems from today's cyber breaches, you're faced with 2 choices. Now, you tell me which you think is more effective in achieving the end goal of protecting account data. Waiting for a breach to happen, then hoping that you can detect it in time to stop it, and then working to recover any lost data, or preventing a security breach in the first place. The answer is pretty obvious, isn't it? So the intent of the standards when considering today's threat landscape is not to detect a breach after account data has already been compromised and then try to stop or fix the breach, and there are many public examples of why that equals failure. Rather, the intent is to prevent it from happening in the first place. And of course, I doubt any one of us here would really need much convincing to agree that legacy AV cannot prevent today's cyber breaches. After all, almost all endpoints and server systems today are quote-unquote protected by traditional AV, and we still have millions of records of account data lost every year. So clearly, knowing that the intent of the PCI DSS is to protect account data, understanding that the best way to accomplish that in today's threated landscape is to prevent cyber breaches from happening in the first place, and recognizing that legacy AV cannot prevent today's cyber breaches, then logically that leads us to the fact that legacy AV can no longer meet the intent of the PCI data security standards. Now, there's an important question that you should be asking yourself because it highlights an important eventuality that will affect your organization in the near future. And that is, if the PCI Security Standards Council also recognized these facts, then why has it not updated these standards yet? Now, there are three basic reasons for that. Number one, until recently, there haven't been many viable alternatives to traditional antivirus. And this will become important later on when we discuss the technical solution that our customers use to replace their AV and remain PCI compliant. And when it comes to developing standards, the wheels turn very, very slowly. We're talking about a decision made by a committee. Now imagine how long it takes for a major decision to be made in your organization. Multiply that by a factor of 10, and you're thinking in the right time frame when it comes to a decision made by a committee that is assembled from multiple professionals from multiple companies across different industries. But rest assured, they realize the gap and they will be updating it soon enough, so you better prepare for the changes, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. But first, let's take a look at the standards and see which of the requirements are affected by, called for, or mentioned antivirus. Now, this is a 60,000-foot view of the standards, and unfortunately, there is no pretty way of putting this on a slide. But I won't spend a lot of time on this one. Again, I'm assuming that you're already familiar with these to some degree. But what I wanted to point out here are the specific requirements that relate to antivirus in some way. And those are the ones that are pointed to by the arrows here. Now, we'll get back to these in a moment. For now, though, it's important that you understand that you and your QSA deal with this discrepancy between the legacy AV's ability to meet the letter of the requirement versus its ability to meet the intent of the requirement. So let's talk about that for just a moment. Now, your QSA might interpret the PCI DSS requirements in one of two ways. They might consider whether you meet the intent of the requirement or whether you meet the letter of the law, if you will. Now, if your QSA is looking at how you meet the intent, then what you need to do is just to show them how you satisfy the intent. So that's pretty straightforward. If, on the other hand, the QSA needs to stick to the letter of the law, quote unquote, then you need to express how you have compensating controls that offer the same level of protection as traditional antivirus. The fact is, QSAs are professionals in their fields, just like you and I. They recognize antivirus is no longer effective. They probably have customers who have AV and have been breached, so they understand compliance does not equal security. If you can show them that you are securing your systems in ways that are better than what legacy AV can, they will want you to give them a way to keep your compliance valid. And this will become very important later on, so stay with me and I'll tell you how this applies. So the key here is to find a way to both meet the intent of the standards requirements and the letter of the requirements. So how do you do that? Now let's go back to the list of requirements that we had that we mentioned that are affected by AV and take a deeper look at them. Now obviously you want to start with meeting the intent of the requirements, which as we said earlier is to prevent breaches in the first place in order to protect account data. And here are some of the specific requirements that whatever security solution you choose to replace your traditional antivirus with has to also meet. Again, I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but it's good to review it quickly so we can talk about the technical solution that enables you to accomplish all of this. So looking at the very first one, that's standard requirement number 1.4, which talks about installing a personal firewall software or equivalent functionality in any portable devices that connect to the internet when outside the network, which also are used to access your CDE. So, and then it talks about some of the firewall requirements and the configurations that you have to achieve. The next one is 2.2.3, which talks about implementing additional security features for any required services or protocols or daemons that are considered to be insecure. And the meat of this, now we're getting to the areas where they're very directly related to antivirus. Section 5.1.1 talks about ensuring that your antivirus programs are capable of detecting, removing, and protecting against all known types of malicious software. 5.1.2 talks about, for systems that are considered to be not commonly affected by malicious software, that you perform some periodic evaluation so you can identify any evolving malware threats and come up with some protections against them. Again, as you see, we're now delving more deeper into the specific requirements for where antivirus is called by name. In 5.2, which I think is the real core of this, is talking about ensuring that your antivirus mechanism, they maintain, they're kept current, and they perform periodic scans and then generate audit logs that are retained per the DSS requirements. 5.3 talks about ensuring that your AV mechanisms are actively running and that can't be disabled by your end users unless they're authorized. 6.2 talks about ensuring that all the system components and software that are protected from known vulnerabilities by installing applicable patches. So this is the one that talks about making sure that if you have a critical patch, you install it as quickly as possible. And then we have sections 10.3, 1 through 5, 1 through 6, that essentially talk about logging relevant information. And the last two will be section 10.5, which talks about making sure that your audit trails are protected, that they're only accessible by authorized individuals, that you have audit trails turned on and you back them up. And last but not least is section 10.7, which talks about retaining the audit trail for at least 1 year or a minimum of 3 months immediately afterwards for analysis. So those are just sort of top level, some of the specific requirements that relate specifically to antivirus or are the types of protection mechanisms that antivirus is involved in some way. So now that we've covered these requirements, the million-dollar question is, how do you actually accomplish the goals of meeting both the intent of the requirement, which is to protect account data by preventing breaches, and meeting the letter of the requirements that we just talked about? Now, there are essentially 5 core capabilities that you have to require from whatever AV replacement product that you choose if you're going to achieve the goals that we set out. The first capability or requirement is to focus on prevention. And this is going right up to the intent that we were talking about, which is making sure that you are protecting and preventing breaches in the first place. Now, over the past few years, the security industry as a whole has struggled and more often failed to prevent successful breaches. And we can partially attribute this to the industry's collective focus on improving detection and response time. Now, obviously, as we said earlier, better detection only narrows the window of time for identifying an attack in progress, but it really doesn't do much to address the need for protecting those valuable account information before it's lost or damaged. So, and you can see the evidence of this, as I said earlier, in an increasing number of records that are lost year over year. So a focus on prevention is really the only effective, scalable, and sustainable way of reducing the frequency and the impact of these cyber breaches. Detection and response obviously does have a place, but it really needs to come in secondary because once you have a breach, the data could have already been lost, and you essentially have failed the intent of the requirement. The second capability or requirement is to prevent both known and unknown malware. Now, as you remember earlier, we just talked about, the requirements talk about preventing known malware, but not necessarily unknown malware. Now, a complete solution for preventing security breaches on the endpoint has to prevent the successful execution of malware from both, not just known, but also unknown. the unknown is actually the bigger problem here, just because of the fact that the attackers and cyber criminals now have scalability on their side, and with a push of a button, they can generate hundreds of thousands of unknown variants of an existing malware and launch it at your organization. So this malware prevention capability it has to cover both known and unknown, and it also cannot really involve signatures or require prior knowledge of the malware to prevent the execution of the malware. Remember, that's one of the things that makes traditional AV ineffective. And let's not forget that effective prevention of both common and advanced malware means that you need to have multiple analysis and prevention methods that can be tuned for maximum effectiveness against each of those. And I'll address that in just a moment. Now, the third requirement is to be able to prevent both known and zero-day exploits. Now, this is one of the most effective ways to circumvent existing endpoint security solutions is to use exploits, especially those that leverage unknown software vulnerabilities, which are often called zero-day exploits. Especially crafted data file or content like, say, a weaponized Adobe PDF or Microsoft Word document that contains some kind of a zero-day exploit essentially evades traditional antivirus solutions and then subverts that legitimate application. And because a vendor's security patch doesn't exist for the underlying vulnerability, most organizations have very few options to prevent those kinds of zero-day exploits, which generally serve as the initial stages of a targeted attack. So even if you were meeting the letter of the requirement by patching as quickly as you had access to a security patch, you could still be left vulnerable because of exploits and zero-day exploits. So this is where you can see where the letter of the requirements are actually lagging behind what we see in actuality in the threat landscape and how attackers are actually penetrating systems. And maybe that's one of the reasons why systems that are PCI compliant continuously still get compromised. So that was the third capability. Now, the fourth capability is to automatically integrate threat intelligence into prevention, create prevention automatically from your threat intelligence. And I alluded to this earlier, attackers now have access to free and low-cost tools that let them very quickly and very cheaply generate new and unique attacks that evade detection by the traditional signature-based antivirus. So it's really critical that your organization uses the threat intelligence that's gained anywhere else through encounters with other new and possibly unique attacks to then prevent those security breaches in your environment. And your AV replacement needs to automatically be able to detect known malware and then quickly identify unknown malware and then block both of them from infecting your system. And that's how you would actually need to meet the intent of protecting the environment. And last but not least, your AV replacement also needs to have been validated by an independent QSA to help you to meet the requirements of the PCI DSS. Those being just the list that we just reviewed together in the previous slide. Now, in your organization, that might be slightly different depending on your particular situation, but at the very least, you want to have an AV solution or AV replacement solution that has been validated by an independent QSA. So these are the 5 core capabilities that you should be looking for in an AV replacement. Of course, there are additional considerations. After all, we're talking about replacing a major component of your security or traditional security that has been in existence perhaps for decades. But even though security capabilities are, for the most part, the primary considerations when you're looking at replacing AV, there are other non-security considerations that may have a significant impact on your ability to actually meet your security needs. And these would be things like operational efficiency or support for unpatchable systems and customizability to meet your business requirements. So there are varying other ones that are also important. So be sure to keep these and these types of issues in mind as well. All right, so now that you have a better understanding of what you should be looking for in an AV replacement, let's talk about a very important question that will help you cut through a lot of the confusion and noise in the endpoint security market so you can gauge your options and then identify the ultimate AV replacement system that fits your specific needs. And that question is, how do you actually deliver prevention in a comprehensive, effective, and systematic way? Fortunately, there are many examples around us for what's required to create a successful system of prevention. Now, take, for example, a modern supercar. Now, the ideal goal, of the end goal for a supercar is to prevent injury to the driver and passenger while maximizing performance. Now, in order to accomplish that, modern cars deploy a combination of multiple preventive methods. Each of these would have then its own purpose-built and specific set of functions, preventing functions that are purpose-built and tuned to accomplish something specific. So, for example, they could include a traction control system, a collision avoidance system, an impact mitigation system, and so forth and so on. What's important here is that each of these systems is built for a specific purpose. So a traction control system is designed to prevent loss of control. It's not designed to dissipate the kinetic energy of an impact in an accident. That's the job of the impact mitigation system. That includes, for example, a crumble zone and side impact bars and those types of things. But so the important thing to remember from this analogy is that you don't want to be stretching a particular method to accomplish things that it wasn't initially designed for. And this is a great example of why legacy AV doesn't seem to be able to manage the myriad security requirements and protection requirements that we're placing on it, because it simply wasn't designed to accomplish all of the things that we now have to accomplish in today's threat landscape. So this approach of deploying a combination of multiple purpose-built methods allows a modern car to prevent injury to the driver and passenger in a comprehensive, effective fashion while maximizing performance. And this is the exact approach that is most effective in prevention. And that's exactly the approach that our product, Traps, takes to preventing security breaches and meeting the requirements of PCI DSS. And this is how our customers protect their environment. Now, to just summarize all of this, the way Traps accomplishes this is it combines these multiple prevention methods, each of which then in turn uses multiple purpose-built techniques. And that allows us to accomplish three important goals. Number one is it allows us to provide maximum coverage for the types of attacks that we're seeing. You recall earlier we were talking about exploits and malware being the two types of attack vectors that you want to be able to protect your environments against. So it allows us to do that. And also because each of these techniques is purpose-built for a particular function, it avoids the pitfall that I just mentioned, which is pushing a single technique or method to cover threats that it really wasn't designed for. Now, of course, it also allows us to tune the system to its strength so that at any point we're providing the maximum effectiveness. Now, this method is exactly what Traps is implementing. So let's take a quick look at how we do that with the malware side, because that is the main part that's actually named within the PCI DSS, and it's one of the core threat vectors that we're seeing in today's threat landscape. Now, at the core of our malware prevention capability is the inspection and analysis through WildFire Threat Intelligence Cloud. The WildFire itself uses multiple methods and techniques, as I'll show you in just a second, but Traps leverages the power of our WildFire Threat Intelligence Cloud to prevent known malware and to detect unknown malware. And WildFire is essentially our automated malware analysis system that's cloud-based. And as a side note, Forrester published their WAVE report in April of 2016, and they cited WildFire as the leader in automated malware analysis. And that report's available on our site if you wanted to take a look at it. But what I wanted to highlight here is the way that these multiple methods of prevention work together hand in hand, and how WildFire by itself is a good example of that. Because when you look at WildFire, you'll see that inside of it, there are multiple ways that we're analyzing a given malware or a given piece of potentially malicious executable. There are essentially two categories of examinations or inspections, if you will, that we apply to any unknown executable file. One is static analysis, which looks at the file's attributes before it's actually executed, so looking at the characteristics of the file itself. Another one is dynamic analysis, which is executing the file in a sandbox and watching what it does, from network traffic to what files it writes to how it manages and manipulates memory and so forth and so on. So these would be the methods, and within each one of these, there are multiple techniques that are designed to accomplish something very specific. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details here because I just want to give you a quick overview about this. But let's pick a couple of examples here. When we're looking at static analysis, we're looking at the file anomaly detection, for example. Just looking at a file and its attributes, you can tell whether the file, for example, has a checksum that's incorrect, or there are parts of the file that are designed to be executable and they contain values that don't match what they're supposed to contain. So those types of anomalies we can look at. On the dynamic side, we could look at things like what is this file doing with regards to network traffic when it's executing, or how does it behave when we execute it against multiple operating systems. You want to be able to analyze it as much as you can and come up with a verdict whether this is a malicious or benign file. So this is a great example of a multi-method prevention technology that's itself a multi-method approach. So that's WildFire, but the caveat to WildFire is that, well, it's a web-based system, and in order for you to use it, you have to be online. But Traps luckily does provide 5 other methods, and I'm going to quickly go through these so we can move on to the next set of topics. The second malware prevention method that Traps delivers is called static analysis. And this method evaluates an executable file before it's allowed to run by looking at hundreds of characteristics or attributes of the file itself, just like WildFire does. But this is done locally on the file without needing to actually connect anywhere. And so static analysis is really effective in preventing malware variants that have never been seen before. And this is the area where I mentioned earlier the PCI DSS requirements don't necessarily call out the ability to prevent unknown malicious executables. And so we do provide that as part of the capabilities of Traps. And this is very important, the fact that it's effective in environments where you're not connected to the environment, to the network, and can't take advantage of all of the other capabilities that WildFire provides. So that's the second malware prevention capability. The third one is what we call execution restrictions. And this prevention method essentially reduces the attack surface of your environment using policies that can be defined for any object in your Active Directory. For example, you could define a policy that says, I don't want any user to be able to run anything off of a removable USB drive or off of a particular network drive. Essentially, this allows you to limit where something can be run in your environment. And the fourth method is called trusted publisher identification. What this allows you to do is it enables you to automatically and immediately identify any new executable files that are published and digitally signed by a trusted and reputable software publisher. And because we trust these publishers, we know who they are, and we can verify that they have actually produced these new executables. Let's say they are a brand new set of updated Microsoft Office, Outlook, Word, Excel, because you just updated your Microsoft Office environment. Because of these files are now all brand new, but if they're digitally signed by Microsoft and we trust Microsoft and we can verify that trust all the way to the root certificate, we don't have to analyze these files anymore. We allow them to run. So in some ways, this is allowing you to allow an unknown good file to execute in the environment, essentially giving you a lot of operational efficiency, so you don't have to do a whole lot of analysis on new files that you trust are good. The fifth method among the multi-method prevention capabilities of Traps is what we call admin override policies. And this essentially allows you to define a policy based on the hash of a file that controls what is allowed to run in your environment and what's not. So think of this as a fine-grained whitelisting or blacklisting capability that can control the execution of any executable in your file. So for example, you can prevent a specific application from running in your environment, or if you have applications that you've developed in-house, you can allow them to run anywhere in the organization without having to check them every time they run. So this is very useful. And last but not least, we're talking about quarantining files. Again, this is an essential part of preventing malicious files from propagating in the environment. So any file that we identify as malicious, we quarantine and prevent it from propagating in the environment. So this is, again, how Traps provides multiple malware prevention methods. Each of them excels at a particular prevention function. Each of them implements multiple preventive techniques that are built on purpose to deliver a particular prevention capability. And together, this approach delivers that maximum coverage against malware, both known and unknown, with a high degree of accuracy. So this essentially allows us to meet the intent of the requirement or at least part of the intent of the requirement, by making sure that known and unknown malware cannot execute in the environment. So that's malware prevention. Now, the second item on our list of 5 core capabilities was exploit prevention. So let's turn our attention to that one for just a moment. Similar to what we covered earlier on the malware side, Traps implements a multi-method approach to preventing exploits. The first exploit prevention method that Traps has is called memory corruption prevention. Now, memory corruption is a category of exploitation techniques where the exploit manipulates the operating system's normal memory management mechanisms for the application that's trying to open the weaponized data file that contains the exploit. So if you're, for example, receiving a weaponized PDF file and you opening it with Adobe Acrobat Reader, the weaponized PDF file could take advantage of a vulnerability in Adobe Acrobat Reader and then change the way that the memory management of the application is being used, and then cause it to subvert the application. Some of the techniques that you may have heard of are things like heap spray and return-oriented programming or rope. Those are 2 typical memory corruption exploitation techniques. The second exploit prevention method is called logic flaw prevention. And logic flaw is, again, a category of exploitation techniques that essentially the exploit manipulates the operating system's normal processes that are used to support and execute the target application. So we're talking about Adobe Acrobat Reader, opening up a PDF file that's weaponized. This would essentially, for example, replace a dynamic link library or a DLL that's normally loaded into Adobe Acrobat Reader with a malicious DLL that's part of that weaponized data file. So that would be an example of a technique called DLL hijacking. And third, last but not least, is malicious code execution prevention. And again, here, this is the end goal of every exploit, essentially to execute some kind of arbitrary code to these are the codes that are embedded in the weaponized data file. And this prevention method prevents those from executing. So Traps also delivers a multi-method approach to preventing exploits. So that was the second piece of the 5 core things that you need to be looking for in any AV replacement technology that you choose. But the most interesting part here isn't the methods, it's how Traps implements these. And it's something that's very unique to Traps. It's something that Traps pioneered in the industry. And if you look at how you would typically go about preventing exploits, number one is what the PCI DSS is now recommending, which is patching the application. Now, the problem with this is that patching applications requires you to have prior knowledge of the vulnerabilities and have a patch handy. And as we said earlier, especially with zero-day exploits, there may be no patches available. And even if you had the patches, your organization may not be able to apply them as quickly as you need to. So you're essentially betting that you can secure your environment with patches before an attacker can actually take advantage of the underlying vulnerabilities, which, as you all know, is wishful thinking in most cases. The other choice is to keep track of all the exploit signatures and behavior patterns of all known exploits, and then try to detect them or in some ways come up with some kind of an algorithm or some kind of a signature or behavioral method to identify them as they're actually happening. And again, this requires prior knowledge of a weaponized exploit and also requires you to have a working sample. And as anyone who's ever done any exploit research knows, finding a sample that works is not always easy. So if you look at both of these problems, something very important pops out here. And that is, if you were to meet the letter of the requirements of PCI DSS, you would still be exposed. Because even if you did both of these, you still have the problem of the unknown exploits that you don't know about. So you will still fail to meet the intent, which was preventing account data from being lost. Now, what we do with Traps and how our customers are protected is very unique. And our approach with Traps is we block the core exploit techniques that all attackers use as part of their exploitation attempts. And those are the heap spray and DLL hijacking, those techniques that I mentioned earlier. And Traps does this without depending on patching, signatures, or behavioral detection, and doesn't require any prior knowledge of the underlying vulnerabilities. And this is really important because even if you didn't get to patch, you could still make the case that your applications are protected because Traps prevents the exploitation of those applications that are yet unpatched. And this is also very important if you have unpatchable systems in your environment. For example, if you have Windows XP or Windows Server 2003, any of those systems or applications that are no longer supported by their respective vendor and are not receiving security patches. So really the first or second options are not essentially available to you. Now this has two very important implications. One, Traps doesn't distinguish between known and unknown. It blocks them both. So a zero-day exploit is just another exploit that Traps blocks as a matter of course, regardless of the underlying application's vulnerabilities and regardless of the fact that whether you've patched it or not. And two, Traps has tremendous longevity as a product, and as we said, there are a finite number of exploitation techniques, and Traps blocks them. So, and I'll show you how that actually translates into a real-life example. But as you can see from the slope of the blue line, the blue graph line that you see on your screen, there aren't that many new exploitation techniques that are being discovered year over year. So, and all attackers have to use a subset of the known attack techniques in order to be able to exploit an otherwise legitimate application. And Traps will be able to block them. In case in point, here's an example of a real example of one of our customers. It's a bank to be exact. And this customer recently witnessed that Traps prevented an exploit in their production environment. And back in April of 2015, a vulnerability in Adobe Flash Player was discovered. And in October, this customer realized that some attacker was trying to exploit this vulnerability to break into their environment. Now, of course, they had Traps installed, and Traps blocked the attempt. It was Traps version 2.3.6, and they had not really updated or patched it since they installed it. So this by itself is not that interesting a problem, because from April to October of 2015, this exploit was known. And even though most antivirus solutions would not have blocked this exploit, despite the fact that it's known, we don't really consider that a very challenging problem because, well, it was known. You better be blocking known exploits from infecting your environment. But what's remarkable here is the version of Traps 2.3.6 actually was released over a year before the exploit was discovered and patched. So back in March of 2014 is version 2.3.6's release date. Now, had this been a zero-day exploit that had come out right after March of 2014, then this particular customer would have been protected against that exploitation of Adobe Flash Player. So in effect, what Traps is able to do is prevent zero-day and unknown exploits that haven't yet even been discovered from infecting an environment. So that's really important because, again, we're talking about the unknown rather than just only the known, which typically most antivirus solutions also don't block because it's an exploit. All right, so that covers the first three of our core capabilities. The fourth one was to be able to turn threat intelligence into prevention and to be able to do it automatically. Now, in our case, we have a next-generation security platform which consists of our firewalls on the perimeter, our Traps advanced network protection on the endpoint, and WildFire, which is our threat intelligence cloud. But what's remarkable about this and how this actually works in our environment is that if a threat is first seen through the next-gen firewalls, that malware is shared through WildFire for analysis and inspection. And once a verdict on that particular piece of unknown executable, whether it's a malware or not, is rendered by WildFire, all of the endpoints from that point forward will block that malware from executing. And the vice versa, or the reverse of this is also true. If you see a malware for the very first time on one of the endpoints that are protected by Traps, then WildFire will analyze that unknown malware, and then from that moment forward, all of our next-gen firewalls will block that particular malware from entering the perimeter. So this is something that's very unique to our next-gen security platform, and one of the core reasons that Palo Alto Networks has been so successful in helping our customers prevent security breaches across their entire computing environment. And what's really interesting here is that this next-gen security platform the components of it are community components. If you think of all of the next generation firewalls that are distributed amongst all of our customers across the world, collecting information about new and unique threats that they're seeing, and then sharing them with your instances of traps in your environment, you are taking advantage of the threat intelligence that's being gained everywhere else and then automatically protecting your environment from that. And as we said earlier, that sort of automation and scalability is critical because the attackers now have access to that type of automation and scalability as well. So that was the fourth item on our list. And last but not least, the fifth item on our core capabilities that your AV replacement has to provide in order to meet both the intent and the letter of the PCI DSS requirements is to also be verified by an independent QSA for its ability to help you meet PCI compliance. And that's exactly what Traps has already accomplished. And this is a report that's available to you on our website. It's issued by CoalFire, and they reviewed Traps for its ability to help customers meet PCI DSS compliance. And essentially, their verdict was that if you are PCI compliant and you replace your traditional antivirus with Traps, you can still remain PCI compliant. So those were the 5 core capabilities, and these capabilities empower our customers to replace their legacy AV with Traps and still remain PCI compliant. Now, if you don't use any of our components, those 5 qualifications, those 5 core capabilities, are the capabilities that you should still be looking for in any solution that you choose to deploy in your environment. All right, so that's all the content that I have for you today. Let's take a few questions, but while we do that, here are some of the resources that I mentioned in the presentation. If you want to learn more about Traps, just go to go.paloaltonetworks.com/traps. And of course, the CoalFire PCI DSS validation is available to you as well. There's the URL for it on the screen right there. And we also have a report that we issued earlier in 2016 that talks about the top 10 zero-day exploits of 2015 and how Traps blocks them as well, and that's available to you as well. Now, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them into the question box that's in the BrightTalk screen, and I'll answer them. I have a couple of questions that have come in already, so I'll go through and answer a few of these, and then we'll adjourn. So first question says, can Traps completely replace my current antivirus solution? Yes, the answer is yes. And as I mentioned earlier, if you are an organization that requires to remain PCI compliant, if you replace your AV with Traps, you can still maintain your PCI compliance. So yeah, you certainly can. Next question is, how often do you have to update Traps to make sure it has the most current signatures? That's a great question, and I apologize if this wasn't very clear in the discussion. Traps actually doesn't use any signatures at all. There is no signatures used anywhere within the Traps protection mechanisms at all. If you remember the 6 malware prevention mechanisms that I mentioned to you, and the 3 exploit prevention mechanisms, none of them require signatures. The only thing that Traps does is look at the hash of a file, which is a one-way mathematical function that results in a 64-character representation of the file, which is unique, and checks the file against its repository in WildFire Threat Intelligence Cloud to see if that particular file has been seen. That's the only thing that Traps calculates, if you will, about the file, outside of what we do with static analysis. So there are no signatures used at all, so the answer is never. Okay, next question. What OSs does Traps run on? Does it support Mac and Linux? Great question. So Traps currently runs on any environment that's Windows-based, including the ones that are no longer supported by Microsoft. And Traps currently doesn't support Mac or Linux, but we do realize that our customers require those, so that's definitely on our radar. Next question is, can Traps do periodic scans? So that's a really great question. If you recall from PCI requirement 5.2, scanning was one of the things that's required. And Traps doesn't do periodic scan in the terms of, say, doing it every 24 hours or every 48 hours. Instead, Traps does its quote-unquote scanning every time you execute a file. In other words, every time an executable file is being executed by a user, that file is being checked to see if it's malicious or not. So it's more a just-in-time scanning as opposed to scanning every 48 hours. And if you think about it, which is more secure, scanning every 48 hours or scanning every time you run a file? And so obviously every time is more secure, so that's the approach that Traps takes. Another question, I stepped away for a minute, so maybe you've already answered it. Is Traps available for Mac endpoints? If not, when? Yeah, I think I already answered that. So Traps for Mac is not available yet, but it is something that's on our radar. Let's see, how many PCI compliant customers do you have that have replaced their AV with Traps? So we do have customers that have actually accomplished that, but unfortunately I can't give you any numbers because Palo Alto Networks doesn't comment on the number of customers, especially at the moment we don't do that. So unfortunately I won't be able to give you specific numbers, but we do have customers that have actually accomplished that. Another question is, can Traps live with a traditional antivirus software in the same environment? And yes, the answer is absolutely. You can run them side by side if you want to. The consideration is, would you really want to? If Traps can provide superior protection and it can help you meet your PCI compliance requirements, then why would you need antivirus, traditional antivirus? But you certainly can if you want to. Next question, can you talk about the footprint of Traps? Yes, so that's something that I didn't go into details in the presentation. Traps actually has a very minimal footprint on the endpoint. When it's running, it consumes about 0.1% CPU cycles. It requires about 50 megabytes of memory to run. And when the static analysis engine kicks in, and that's only for unknown executable files, it'll require an extra 80 megabytes of RAM. And you also need 250 megabytes of disk space to install it, plus whatever amount of space you want to allocate to logs. So minimal footprint, actually. Let's see, another question. Is there any way for Traps to deal with machines that do not have Traps installed, such as consultant machines or non-trusted remote user machines? No, unfortunately, the answer is no. If the machines are not under Traps management, then Traps can't protect them. In order for you to protect an environment or a system with Traps, you have to install Traps on it, and that means you have to manage that installation of Traps. So it's not something that you can install on somebody else's machine and just let them be by themselves. You need to actually manage that instance of Traps. Excuse me. Can I allow exceptions, allow a process to bypass? Yeah, of course. So if you remember, I was talking about admin override policies. So if you have a particular executable file that you want to allow to run in your environment, you can define an admin override policy that says, whenever this particular file or this particular process with this particular hash executes an environment, allow it to run. And of course, you can do the opposite as well. Next question, can Traps be turned off by the end user? The answer is no. I mean, that's one of the requirements of PCI DSS, that your endpoint protection cannot be turned off by the end user. So that's something that's not doable. There are ways to turn it off from the admin console, but the end user wouldn't have access to that. Next question, what is the difference between WildFire with Traps and WildFire with Palo Alto Networks firewalls? Can you explain how they work together? Yeah, that's a great question. So when you subscribe to WildFire with our next generation firewalls, then you can actually submit many more different types of files up to WildFire for analysis. So you can submit PDF files, Microsoft Word files, URLs, all kinds of different data you can transmit up to WildFire for analysis. When the access that you get to WildFire with Traps is limited to executable files. So these are portable executables. So .scr, .exe, those types of files are the ones that Traps submits up to WildFire for analysis. It doesn't submit any of the other types of files that you can submit with WildFire when you subscribe to it from a next-gen firewall. And of course, they do work together because it's the same instance of WildFire that's receiving the intelligence. So regardless of where this intelligence comes from or where the malware is being submitted to WildFire for analysis, both the endpoint and the next-gen firewalls can still take advantage of the threat intelligence. And that's what this previous slide was highlighting. I'll just go back to it for a second. Okay, last question for the day. Does traps at high CPU overload on device? So no, as I mentioned earlier, the CPU load is only about 0.1%, so it's quite minimal. In fact, users typically won't even notice traps is running in the background until there is an exploit or a malware prevention event occurring, in which case the traps will pop into action and prevent the exploitation or malware execution, and then notify the user that we prevented something. They'll essentially get a dialog box that tells them a prevention event occurred and we stopped something bad from happening. All right, great. That's all the questions I have time for. Thank you very much for being here. I hope you enjoyed it. I would very much appreciate your feedback in the Bright Talk window, and I look forward to visiting with you at our next event. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.